First of all, I want to thank you for inviting me. I'm really honored. This is a very special pleasure for me, and I'm delighted to be here. What I want to do is, in this talk, I want to link a number of themes. I want to talk about neoliberalism, and I want to talk about its relationship to the pandemic that now has become, of course, a global phenomenon. I also want to talk about the rise of fascism, an updated version of fascism that I think we see emerging in various parts of the globe. From there, I want to talk about what I call the dictatorship of ignorance. And then I want to talk about the importance of language and what I think that means, particularly a critical language. Then I'm going to end by talking about the role of education in the midst of the crisis and what role we might play as educators to basically address in some way matters of economic justice and social equality. So I'm not sure I'm going to cover all of those things, but bear with me in the hopes that I can get through it all. And of course, I'll answer any questions you have once I'm done.
Okay, thank you.
Across the globe, democratic institutions such as the independent media, schools, the legal system, certain financial institutions, and higher education are under siege. The promise, if not the ideals of democracy, are receding as the barbarians who breathe new life into a fascist past are once again on the move, subverting language, values, courage, vision, and a critical consciousness. Education has increasingly become a tool of domination as right-wing pedagogical apparatuses controlled by the entrepreneurs of hate attack workers, the poor, people of color, refugees, immigrants from the South, and others considered disposable. In the midst of an era when an older social order is crumbling and a new one is struggling to define itself, there often emerges times of confusion, danger, and moments of great restlessness. The present moment is once again at an historical conjuncture in which the structures of liberation and authoritarianism are kind of vying for shaping a future that appears to be either an unthinkable nightmare or in some ways a kind of realizable dream. We've arrived at a moment in which two worlds are colliding, and the history of the present is poised at a point when possibilities are either realized or rejected, but never disappear completely. First, there is the harsh and crumbling worlds of neoliberal globalization and its mobilizing passions that fuel different strands of fascism across the globe, and of course, right now, including the United States. Power is now enamored of amassing profits, and capital is increasingly addicted to a politics of white nationalism and racial cleansing. Second, there are growing, of course, counter movements, especially among young people, with their search for a new politics that can in some way rethink, reclaim, and reinvent a new understanding of democratic socialism untainted by capitalism. What is not in doubt is that something sinister and horrifying is happening to liberal democracies across the globe. The global thrust towards democratization that emerged after World War II is giving way to authoritarian tyrannies. As alarming as the signs may be, the public cannot look away and allow the terrors of the unforeseen to be given free rein. For those who believe in democratic socialism, we cannot allow the dreams and militant hopes to turn to ashes. We now live in a world that resembles a dystopian novel. The COVID-19 crisis created a surrealist nightmare that floods our screens and media with images of fear. We can no longer shake hands. We can't embrace our friends, use public transportation, sit in a coffee shop, or walk down the street without experiencing anxiety and fear. What must be acknowledged is that the pandemic is more than a medical concept. It also refers to ideological and political plagues that emerged as a result of the irresponsible response of the US and other countries, such as Brazil, India, to the COVID crisis. Marked by inept leadership, rooted in a distrust of science and reason and a blind allegiance to market forces, what emerged over time was unimaginable suffering, massive deaths, and a further legitimation of lies and right-wing violence. The horror of the pandemic often blinds us to the fact that anti-democratic economic and political forces that have privatized and prioritized profits over human needs have grinded away at the social order for at least the last 40 years, at least since the 1970s. And in Argentina, of course, one thinks of the dictatorship during that period. A form of predatory capitalism has waged war on the welfare state, public spheres, and the common good since the 70s. As a form of predatory capitalism, neoliberalism believes that the market should govern all aspects of society. This is really interesting because they don't just argue that neoliberalism should govern the market and the economy, but everything, all aspects of social life. It concentrates wealth in the hands of a financial elite and elevates regulation and privatization as the governing principles of society. Under neoliberalism, everything is for sale, and the only obligation of citizenship is consumerism. At the same time, it ignores basic needs such as healthcare, food, decent wages, and quality education. Neoliberalism views government as the enemy of the market, limits society to the realm of the family and individual, embraces a kind of fixed hedonism, and challenges the very idea of the public good. We live in an age when economic activity is divorced from social cost. That is one of its greatest crimes. There is no consideration of the ethical or matters of social responsibility. While policies that produce racial cleansing, militarism, and staggering inequality have become defining features of everyday life and established modes of governance. Clearly, there is a need to reclaim a notion of democratic socialism in which matters of justice, equity, and equality become the central features of a substantive democracy. The good news is that the demonstrations taking place not only in the United States, but across the globe suggest that the spirit of democratic socialism is in the air. The pandemic revealed in all of its ugliness the death-producing mechanisms of systemic inequality, deregulation, a culture of cruelty, and an increasingly dangerous assault on the environment. It also made visible an anti-intellectual culture that derides any notion of critical education. That is, an education that equips individuals to think critically, engage in thoughtful dialogue, appropriate the lessons of history, and learn in some way how to govern rather than be governed. At the same time, the claims of neoliberal capitalism have undermined, as a result of the economic failures and medical horrors let loose by the pandemic, it seems to me what I would say is often unthinkable. Is now said in public, people across the globe who are protesting in many ways what they see as this attack on the welfare state, the safety net, matters of state violence, the plague of poverty, homelessness, and to say the very least, the pollution of the planet. The pandemic is a crisis that cannot be allowed to turn into a catastrophe in which all hope is lost. While this pandemic threatens democracy's ability to breathe, it offers the possibility to rethink politics and the habits of critical education, human agency, and elements of social responsibility. Crucial, it would seem to me, to be crucial to any viable notion of what life would be in a democratic socialist society. Put differently, amid the corpses produced by neoliberal capitalism and COVID-19, there are flashes of hope, a chance to move beyond the contemporary resurgence of authoritarianism. Paulo Freire understood that such a politics is rooted in what he called the pedagogy of hope, one that integrated a kind of critical reading of the world with an attempt to put into practice modes of struggle based on principles of social and economic equality and human freedom. It's hard to imagine a more urgent moment for taking seriously Freire's ongoing attempts to make education central to politics. At stake for Freire was the notion that education was a social concept, one that was rooted in the goal of emancipation for all people. Moreover, this is an education that encourages human agency, one that is not content to enable people to only be critical thinkers, but also engaged individuals and social agents. This is a pedagogy that in some way calls us beyond ourselves, engages the ethical imperative to care for others, dismantle structures of domination, and become subjects rather than objects of history, politics, power, and what it means to govern rather than be governed. If we're going to develop a politics capable of awakening our critical, imaginative, and historical sensibilities, it seems to me that it's crucial for educators and others to remember Freire's ongoing project of literacy. This was a political project in which civic literacy was infused with the language of critique and possibility, and addressed the notion that there is no democracy without critically informed subjects. Such a language is necessary to enable the conditions to forge a collective international resistance among educators, among youth, among artists, and other cultural workers in what I would call defense of public goods. Such a movement is important to resist and overcome the tyrannical fascist nightmares that have descended upon the United States, Brazil, and a number of other countries, plagued by the rise of right-wing populist movements, and to say the very least, the rise of neo-Nazi parties. In an age of social isolation, informed information overflow, a culture of immediacy, consumer glut, and spectacularized violence, it's all the more crucial to take seriously the notion that that democracy cannot exist or be defended without critically, what I would call critically illiterate, engaged agents or citizens. This is really, really quite important for me, because it seems to me in my work, what I'm constantly trying to say was that Marx was only partly right when he said, the purpose is not to interpret the world, but to change it. Well, in fact, you have to understand the world to change it. And it seems to me that places a different kind of emphasis on the role of consciousness and the role of critical thinking and the role of critical literacy and what it means to basically expand the possibilities for people to think outside of established boundaries so that they can actually think of themselves as agents within a very different kind of paradigm. Education, in both its symbolic and institutional forms, it would seem to me, has a crucial role to play in fighting the resurgence of fascist cultures, mythic historical narratives, and the emerging ideologies of white supremacy and white nationalism. I mean, we have here in the United States a president who is talking about passing a law to implement what he calls patriotic education. I don't have to tell this audience what that means, to say the very least, right? It seems to me that as fascists across the globe are disseminating toxic, racist, and ultra-nationalist images of the past, it's essential to reclaim education as a form of historical consciousness and moral witnessing. This is especially true at a time when historical and social amnesia have become sort of a national pastime in many countries, particularly in the United States, matched in many ways only by the masculinization of the public sphere and the increasing normalization of a fascist politics that thrives on ignorance, fear, the suppression of dissent, and hate. Education as a form of cultural work extends far beyond the classroom and its pedagogical influence. And while often imperceptible, it seems to me is crucial to challenging and resisting the rise of fascist pedagogical formations and their rehabilitation of fascist principles and ideas. The pedagogical lesson here is that fascism begins with hateful words, the demonization of others considered disposable, and moves on to attack ideas, the burning of books, the disappearance of intellectuals, and the emergence of the carceral state and the horrors of detention jails and camps, something that I certainly don't need to remind people in Argentina of. As a form of cultural politics, critical pedagogy, I would think, in part, should provide a protected space in which to think against the grain of received opinion, a space to question and challenge, to imagine the world from different standpoints and perspectives, and to reflect upon ourselves in relation to others, and in doing so, to understand what it means to link education to what we would call a sense of political and social responsibility. Cultural politics in the last 20 years has turned toxic as ruling elites increasingly gain control of commanding cultural apparatuses, turning them into pedagogical disimagination machines that serve the forces of ethical tranquilization by providing and legitimating endless degrading and humiliating images of the poor, immigrants, Muslims, and others considered excess or wasted lives doomed to terminal exclusion. The capitalist dream machine is back with huge profits for the ultra-rich, hedge fund managers, and major players in the financial service industries. And these new landscapes of wealth, fraud, and social atomization, a savage and fanatical capitalism promotes, as you know, a kind of winner-take-all ethos, normalizes massive inequalities in wealth and power, and aggressively undermines the welfare state while pushing millions into hardship and misery. The geographies of moral and political decadence have become the organizing standard of the dream worlds of consumption, privatization, surveillance, and deregulation. Within the increasingly fascist landscape, public spheres are replaced by zones of social abandonment and thrive on the energies of the walking dead and the avatars of cruelty and misery. Education within the last 3 decades has diminished rapidly in its capacities to educate young people and others to reflect, to be reflective, and to be, of course, critically and engaged social agents. Under neoliberal regimes, the utopian possibilities formerly associated with public and higher education as a public good, capable of promoting social equality and supporting democracy, have become too dangerous for the apostles of authoritarianism. Increasingly, public schools are subject to the toxic forces of privatization and mindless standardized curricula, while teachers are de-skilled and subject to intolerable labor conditions. Higher education now mimics a business culture run by a managerial army of bureaucrats enamored of market values who resemble the high priest of a deadening instrumental rationality. The commanding visions of democracy are in exile at all levels of education. Critical thought and the imaginings of a better world present a direct threat to neoliberal rationality, in which the future must always replicate the present in an endless circle in which capital and the identities that it legitimates merge with each other into what might be called dead zones of the imagination and pedagogies of repression. This dystopian impulse thrives on producing myriad forms of inequality and violence, encompassing both the symbolic and the structural, as part, I would think, of a broader attempt to define education in purely instrumental, privatized, and anti-intellectual terms. What is clear is that neoliberal modes of education attempt to mold students in the market-driven mantras of self-interest, harsh competition, unchecked individualism, and the ethos of consumerism. Young people are now told to invest in their careers, pack their resumes, and achieve success, at least in the workplace, at any cost. It is precisely of this replacement of educated hope with an aggressive dystopian neoliberal project and cultural politics that it seems to me now characterizes the current assault on public and higher education, not only in the United States and in other places, but of course across the globe. And it seems to me that now, under the mantra of privatization, deregulation, and the destruction of the public good, what we have is a toxic merging of inequality, greed, and of course the nativist language of borders, walls, and camps. It seems to me it's crucial for educators to remember that language is not simply an instrument of fear, violence, and intimidation. It's also a vehicle of critique, civic courage, resistance, and informed agency. If fascism is to be defeated, there's a need to make education an organizing principle of politics. And in part, this can be done with a language that exposes and unravels, it seems to me, falsehoods, systems of oppression, and corrupt relations of power, while making clear that alternative futures are possible. Hannah Arendt was right in arguing that language is crucial in highlighting the hidden, often crystallized elements that make fascism likely. Language in this case is a powerful tool in the search for truth, in the condemnation of falsehoods and injustices. Moreover, it seems to me that it's through language that the history of fascism can be remembered. And the lessons of the conditions that created the plague of genocide can provide the recognition that fascism does not reside solely in the past, and that its traces are always dormant, even in the strongest democracies. Paul Gilroy argues correctly that it's crucial in the current historical moment to re-engage with fascism in order to address how it has changed and crystallized in different forms. And in doing so, quote, to work towards redeeming the term from its trivialization and restoring it to its proper balance in discussions of the moral and political limits of what's acceptable. Gilroy provides one more reason for educators to make the political more pedagogical and the pedagogical more political. The latter is crucial, it seems to me, in order to recognize, as Freire reminds us, that pedagogy is always a struggle over agency, identities, desires, and values, while also acknowledging that it has a crucial role to play in addressing important social issues, while also making clear that it seems to me that it has another crucial role to play in defending public and higher education as democratic public spheres. I mean, the notion that education is simply about producing knowledge, or that it's simply about educating people for the workplace without a more comprehensive understanding of the enormous role that it plays in the struggle over how we define ourselves, how we relate to others, how we relate to the larger world, is basically to not recognize that is to eliminate the very concept of politics and its relationship to education in a way that makes it a force for enormous repression, because it normalizes its view in a way that suggests that it's unchallengeable, and that education is really about the teaching of skills. It's about the maps, it's about standardization. It takes away matters of culture, and of course it takes away matters of justice. It seems to me, at the very least, critical pedagogy should be seen as a form of political intervention in the world, and that it's capable of creating in some way the possibility for individual and social transformation. Turning to the United States, which I think now is increasingly becoming a model for a number of other authoritarian regimes, ignorance now rules America, or the United States, sorry. Not the simple, if somewhat innocent ignorance that comes from the absence of knowledge, but a malicious ignorance, forged in the arrogance of refusing to think hard about issues, to engage language in the pursuit of justice. James Baldwin, the great African-American novelist, was certainly right when he warned in his book, No Name in the Street, that ignorance allied with power is the most ferocious enemy justice can have. Thinking is not simply an act of stupidity or thoughtlessness. It seems to me it's something more. All traces of critical thought often only appear at the margins of culture, as ignorance becomes the primary organizing principle, particularly now in American society. As is well known, Trump's ignorance is on display daily. Not only is he a serial liar, but his ignorance also serves as a tool of power to prevent it seems to me, power from being held accountable. In addition, not only is ignorance the enemy of critical thinking and emancipatory forms of education, but it seems to me it must be made clear that ignorance is not innocent, especially when it proclaims the space of common sense and labels thinking itself dangerous. while exhibiting a disdain for truth, evidence, science, rational judgments. The very conditions that enable people to make informed decisions are under siege. As schools are defunded, media becomes more corporatized, oppositional journalists are killed, and reality TV becomes the model for not only mass entertainment, but becomes the model for mass education. We now live in an age of cruelty, in which we are told that the central mark of our agency is to be at war with each other, unleash our most ruthless and competitive interests inside, learn how to survive in what Naomi Klein calls the cutthroat jungle of late capitalism. It seems to me that given the current crisis of politics, history, agency, and memories, educators need a new political language for addressing and changing contexts and issues, facing a world in which capital draws upon an unprecedented convergence of resources, financial, cultural, political, economic, scientific, military, and technological, to exercise powerful and diverse forms of control. I mean, this is a new social formation. We're not just talking about an extension of old forms of imperialism. I mean, you're talking about new modes of technology, you're talking about the social media, you're talking about the power of culture that has an influence unlike anything it's ever had in the past, and you're talking about the collapse of boundaries. And you're also talking about, it seems to me, the elimination of historical memory and the emergence of what I call cultures of immediacy. This inability to think beyond the moment, the inability and the overflow of information to be trapped in a moment in which the future is always the present. It seems to me that, as a rule, educators have to do more than create the conditions for critical thinking and nourishing a sense of hope for their students. There is no radical politics without a pedagogy capable of awakening consciousness, changing common sense, and creating modes of analysis in which people can discover a moment of recognition that allows them to think beyond the conditions, to rethink the conditions of their lives. I mean, this is really a crucial issue. And I want to just go off on this for a moment because, you know, my friend Stuart Hall used to talk about a politics of identification. And he was very upset with the left because he felt the left never took that really seriously. In other words, they never created a language in which people could actually identify themselves. The language is always somewhere else. It was the language of economic determinism. It was the language of abstract high theory, but it was not a language in which people could see themselves and in doing so, construct modes of identification that would allow them to change and question and engage the nature of their own agency and the conditions around them. And it seems to me, for public intellectuals or academics, this creates an enormously interesting issue because it raises the issue of how do we engage with the public in ways in which we don't sacrifice rigor for being accessible? How do we learn from the cultures that we're going to address? What role does language play here in assuming a sense of responsibility and that it takes seriously, as Paulo Freire well knew, and all of you know, that if you can't talk to people in a way that's meaningful, you can't make it critical and you can't make it transformative. It's not going to work. You know, if you walk into a class of Spanish-speaking students and you're speaking German, you know, people are going to nod their heads and fall asleep. Well, it seems to me that academics are often speaking German. You know, it's wonderful to speak to each other in ways that might illuminate the deep recesses of Lacan's mind. But it seems to me at another level, there is a responsibility here to take seriously what it would mean to educate people in general, to shift the notion of consciousness in a way in which we can begin to make power visible so that people can understand how it works on them and what it might mean for them to work through it. It seems to me that education operates as a crucial site of power in the modern world. And if teachers are truly concerned about safeguarding education, they're going to have to understand how pedagogy functions both at the local and global levels. Critical pedagogy, I think, has an important role to play, to say the very least, in challenging how power, knowledge, and values are deployed, affirmed, and resisted within traditional discourses and cultural spheres. And it seems to me that critical pedagogy in some ways has to come to grips with the fact that the sites of pedagogy have changed. Many of us are in the academy, and many of us have been led to believe, especially me, who, I was born right after Abe Lincoln died, that schooling is basically the only form of education. And what has become clear is that it's not. And in many ways, it may not even be the most important form of education. And I think that people in Latin America certainly have known this, and certainly in some ways in England and in other places, long before theorists began to understand this in the United States. And so the question becomes, how do we understand how these powerful disimagination machines, what C. Wright Mills called these cultural apparatuses that parade in the name of entertainment, are really enormously powerful propaganda machines, play an enormously vital role in shaping identity, in shaping narratives, in normalizing common sense, in normalizing the strictures of privatization, deregulation. I mean, think about the United States, where you now have thousands of people basically protesting governors who are asking them to wear masks. I mean, and how the media basically dominant, conservative media supports this kind of ignorance. That, oh, my freedoms are so important, I don't have to wear a mask, and I can kill my grandmother and others because that's what freedom means. I mean, it's this kind of ideology, this kind of education that in many ways has created what I would call a crisis of ideology and a crisis of agency and a crisis of politics that actually clearly cuts across borders. So that it seems to me that in an age of predatory capitalism and an emerging fascist politics, we have to be concerned with facing the challenge of providing a language that in some ways embraces not only a new understanding of education and the sites in which it takes place, but also a militant utopianism, while consistently being attentive to those forces that seek to turn such hope into a slogan, or to punish and dismiss those who dare look beyond what I would call the horizons of the given. It seems to me that fascism breeds cynicism and is the enemy of militant hope. And hope must be tempered by the complex reality of the times and viewed as a project and condition for providing a sense of collective opposition, a sense of agency, political imagination, and engaged participation. Without hope, even in the most dire times, there's no possibility for resistance, for dissent, or for struggle. Hope expands the space of the possible and becomes a way of recognizing and naming the incomplete nature of the present. Hope is the effective and intellectual precondition for individual and social struggle. Hope, not despair, is the precondition that encourages critique on the part of intellectuals and others in and outside the academy who use the resources of theory to address pressing social problems. Hope is also at the root of the civic courage that translates critique into political practice. For me, hope as the desire for a future that offers more than the present becomes most acute when one's life can no longer be taken for granted. Only by holding on to both critique and hope in such contexts, it seems to me, will resistance become concrete and offer the possibility for transforming politics into an ethical space and a public act. And a better future than the one we now expect to unfold will require nothing more than confronting the flow of everyday experience and the weight of social suffering with the force of individual and collective resistance rooted in an unending project of what I would call democratic social transformation. In the end, there's no democracy without informed citizens, and there's no justice without a language critical of injustice. Democracy begins to fail, and political life becomes impoverished in the absence of those vital public spheres, such as public and higher education, in which civic values, public scholarship, and social engagement allow for a more imaginative grasp of the future that takes seriously the demands of justice, equity, civic courage. Democracy should be a way of thinking about education, one that thrives on connecting pedagogy to the practice of freedom, the learning of ethics, and agency to the imperatives of social responsibility and the public good. Neoliberal capitalism strips hope of its utopian possibility and thrives on the notion that we live in an era of foreclosed hope, and that any attempt to think otherwise will result in a nightmare. Yet the fact remains that with no hope, there is no agency. And without collective agents, there is no hope. There is no resistance. In the age of emerging fascism, it's not enough to connect education with the defense of reason, informed judgment, and critical agency. It also must be aligned with the power of potential and collective resistance. We live in dangerous times, and consequently, there's an urgent need for more individuals, for institutions and movements to come together in the belief that the current regimes of tyranny can be resisted, that alternative futures are possible, and that acting on those beliefs through collective resistance will make real change happen. And I think that one of the things that needs to be said that I have not put in this talk is that if we really are going to talk about a collective resistance in the face of these emerging fascisms that we see everywhere, we're going to have to find a way to bring these divergent groups together and to have them struggle under an umbrella, a theoretical political umbrella that in some fundamental way is attentive to the threads that work through all of these different identities and these different social movements, but recognizes that while in their individual instances they're important, they don't go far enough. We can't talk about racism without talking about democracy. You can't talk about misogyny without talking about democracy. You can't talk about racism without talking about misogyny. You can't talk about racism without talking about the assault on the planet. So it seems to me all these instances represent moments of a democratic struggle, but they're not enough. In their isolation, they're not enough. And the real key is to bring them together under the banner of a movement for the defense of public goods and democratic socialism that allows them to work with each other and to recognize we can't have one without the other. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much for this wonderful speech. We have really enjoyed it. And I would like to invite my colleagues to make some comments in Spanish that I will then translate for you, Henry.
Okay, sure.
Gustavo.
Buen día, Henry. Muchas gracias por tu aporte. La verdad que es para nosotros muy importante tenerte en este congreso y este congreso inicia pensando el lugar de la educación, ¿sí? El lugar de las pedagogías críticas en la educación, y para nosotros eso es en este tiempo que atravesamos muy importante.
Okay. Henry, I would translate this part. I said, Gustavo Gali is just thanking you for being part of this third edition of the Congress of Education and Inclusion from the South, and saying that for this Congress, the centrality is that there is a central place in education and at the same time in highlighting critical pedagogy. So thank you for putting these ideas through that are so related to our topic.
Y ahora le haría la primera pregunta o la primera consulta.
Okay, he's going to start with the first questions. We have some questions for you, and just to start the introduction.
Su exposición atravesó o fue atravesada en gran parte por muchas categorías, ¿sí? Que recupera del trabajo de Paulo Freire. Paulo Freire en nuestro continente, digo, es un referente, pero hace muy poco fue tratado de energúmeno por el presidente Bolsonaro de Brasil, y también hubo el despliegue de un programa que es Escuelas sin Partido, ¿sí? Para despolitizar la escuela en Brasil y para también prohibir, ¿sí? El acceso de Paulo Freire a las escuelas, de las ideas de Paulo Freire a las escuelas. ¿Cómo piensa, ¿sí? ¿Cómo piensa él desde su lugar que frontera de por medio, Argentina, en Argentina debemos trabajar en las aulas concretamente, ¿sí?, las ideas freirianas y las pedagogías críticas.
Okay. Gustavo Gali mentions that in your speech, you mentioned Paulo Freire as a frame, right, of the ideas that you develop. And Paulo Freire, for us, it's a very important reference. And at the same time, he was the one who rescued throughout this conference, and he was called as a madman and banned in Brazil, especially by Bolsonaro, right, with the schools without a party program. So considering that Argentina is on the border with Brazil, how do you think that Freire's legacy should be worked on in Argentinian schools?
Well, I think that, you know, what Freire does is basically claim that it's impossible to talk about education without talking about democracy. And it's impossible to talk about democracy without making young people civically literate, giving them the tools to basically be agents. That if you're going to talk about schooling, you have to ask yourself, you know, how does it function as a democratic public sphere? You know, how does it function in ways that enrich the imagination, enable people to learn how to govern, as I've said before, rather than be governed, and to fight the practices of tyranny. And I think in that sense, you can certainly understand why Bolsonaro claims that Freire is a madman or a mad person, because his ideas are dangerous. They're dangerous to authoritarians. They're dangerous to people who hate critical thinking. They're dangerous to people who might hold power accountable. So what we see in Freire basically is the threat that we see in all modes of education that take democracy seriously.
Okay, thank you. Right.
Y le hago una segunda pregunta y ya pasamos a otro compañero, otra compañera. América Latina es un continente de democracias débiles. Él habló en la conferencia sobre cuestiones relacionadas, ¿sí?, a las ideas, a la cultura, también a la política, ¿sí?, y la pedagogía. Vivimos en tiempos en que en los medios, ¿sí?, se construyen fake news o que gobiernos padecen el lawfare. ¿De qué manera la escuela, ¿sí?, puede posicionarse para dar esa disputa cultural, ¿sí?, en relación a los medios y a la derecha radical?
Okay, so considering that Latin America has weak democracies and that, right, it is an era of fake news and right-wing, let's say, intentions to manipulate the way people think, what would be the role or the place of critical educator in the face of these neo-fascism and the culture of hatred that is reproduced by the media, the fake news, the post-truth? How do you imagine the treatment in classrooms?
I mean, I think that we're seeing the same thing in the United States. And we're seeing actually that move towards cultural apparatuses functioning in such a way as to really limit, as to collapse the distinction between truth and falsehood, so as to, in a sense, undermine the very possibilities of citizenship, right? I mean, this is really not just simply an attack on the truth. It's an attack on the conditions that would allow people to hold power accountable. And I think we want to really make sure we understand that. I think at the same time, what we're seeing is what this suggests is a real struggle over those public spheres and those outlets that serve as cultural apparatuses that produce ideas, that legitimate common sense. I mean, the left, in all of its diversity, has got to take very seriously what it means to develop both alternative public spheres that can counteract this nonsense, expose it, see through it, and provide, it seems to me, narratives that people can understand that really do bear down on their lives. And it also has to expose what's at stake here. That we're not just talking about people who produce fake news, we're talking about people who hide behind lies and who hide behind ignorance. And the question becomes, what interests are being served by this? Who's really being served by the clouds of ignorance? Who's really being served by the claim to fake news? How does it prevent power from being held accountable? How does it diminish the possibility for people to participate in shaping the conditions under which they live their daily lives? So it seems to me at one level, this is a struggle over consciousness. It's a struggle over cultural apparatuses, such as schools, such as the media, such as the social media, the alternative media, and all of those things have to be taken enormously seriously. And thirdly, it means that the question of popular education has to become more vitalized. We really need to reach into the public and find ways to talk to people as intellectuals, as artists, that offsets and counteracts and produces a new language to basically be able to deal with this crap that is being spewed out every day. I mean, look, you know, the thing about Paulo Freire that's so interesting, and it wasn't just Freire, Raymond Williams, Gramsci, it goes back to a whole range of Marxist theorists, you know, who basically argued that imagine politics being a form of permanent education. That's what it is. And now the question is, in that permanence, in the role that it has, how have the sites in which it takes place changed? And what does that tell us about how the nature of the struggle should change for what we do? I don't think education has ever become more central to politics than it is right now. I don't think you can talk about politics without talking about education. And guess what? The right has proven that. It's proven it because it creates an industry of fake news, so-called fake news. It's created an industry where the truth doesn't matter anymore. It's created an industry where being ignorant is a virtue. It's created an industry in which being stupid is really a badge of honor. That shit has to be fought. You know, it has to be exposed. And you have to understand it, not on an epistemological level, but in terms of its consequences. How does that stuff align with power? Whose power? Who's being served? What does it mean in terms of diminishing democracy or expanding it?
Hola, bueno, encantada, después de haberlo leído durante tanto tiempo, poder escucharlo, y me sumo al agradecimiento de mis colegas el que sea parte de este congreso. Y quiero llevarlo a una pregunta que tiene que ver más que nada con lo que usted plantea en este posicionamiento de los jóvenes, entre estos dos mundos que chocan y cómo los jóvenes forman parte muchas veces de estos contramovimientos, ¿no? ¿Podría plantearnos o podría profundizarnos sobre el lugar que usted considera que tienen los jóvenes en esta lucha sostenida en estados democráticos para defender los derechos que tienen? Gracias.
Yeah, it's a terrific question. Norma, thank you for the question. I mean, it seems to me that one of the things that's clear for young people across the globe is that they've been written out of the script of democracy. They've just been written out. Even on the left, it seems to me, we talk about race, we talk about gender, we talk about class, but we don't talk about youth. Youth disappears. They become part of the project of disappearance when it comes to talking about economic and political justice. And I think for many youth, the space of opposition clearly has to be in those sites that not only they're most familiar with and the sites that they inhabit, but also the sites where they have extraordinary skills to be able to work with each other and to basically be able to educate adults who really need often to be educated about the plight that they face. In the United States, we see a lot of youth organizing in schools. They're walking out of schools, they're protesting school violence, and then they're connecting with youth in other countries in order to create international organizations where they can share knowledge. For instance, a lot of young people in the Black Lives Matter movement are now working with Palestinian youth to try to understand how to talk about systemic violence, state violence, and how to fight it. Secondly, clearly, and we all know this, and I know I'm not saying anything new here, forgive me, around the social media. I mean, clearly, you know, when it comes to the social media, youth are far smarter than all of us. I'll speak for myself, sorry. And they know how to organize that stuff. I mean, they know how to use it. They know how to use it for political purposes. And in the midst of that, it seems to me they're creating new kinds of social formations and modes of struggle that focus a great deal on direct action. For instance, with the death of George Floyd in the United States, in the massive uprising that took place, remember, these were multicultural uprisings. I mean, these were not just uprisings on the part of African Americans. There were a lot of young people who participated in this. And from there, started talking about creating alternative economies, different ways to basically disseminate information, alternative schools. So it seems to me that, you know, all of those areas are really crucial. But what's most important for me is for them to create their own social movements. And for those social movements to not just simply be local or national, but to be international. We need an international movement of young people brought together around the defense of socialist democracy. So they can begin to share resources. They can begin to understand how oppression works in different contexts. They can begin to talk to each other as part of an overall larger social movement that can shift and bring pressure at times in different contexts when different forms of tyranny arise. And they've also got to create a movement in the defense, it would seem to me, of free speech, of what it means to speak out. You know, journalists, intellectuals are really under attack. Khashoggi's killing, you know, by the Saudi Arabian government. I mean, and to just let that go by and not to recognize what that means for the future, not to mention what it means historically in Argentina and other places where intellectuals disappeared. I mean, how do we reinvent through young people historical memories that both educate them and educate ourselves? So it seems to me all of those sites are important.
También agradecerte mucho, Henry, tu disposición, y la verdad es una emoción escucharte y conversar con vos, porque nos hemos formado con tu pensamiento, con tus reflexiones, y la verdad que es un orgullo estar conversando aquí. Y permitime también decirte que este congreso es desde el lugar más austral de la Tierra, es desde el lugar que está más al sur de la Argentina. Y vos estás en el hemisferio norte. Y sin embargo, nos has enseñado a pensar desde el sur, estando en el hemisferio norte.
Okay. Before Gabriel starts with his question, he would like to again to thank you for your participation and saying that, well, it is really so thrilling for all of us to be just having a moment with you after reading you so much. And at the same time, he would like to highlight that this Congress is organized and thought from the end of the world. We are here in Tierra del Fuego, in the province of Tierra del Fuego, and you are in the North Hemisphere. And it is just something to highlight that you make us think about the end of the world as the beginning of opportunities from a different hemisphere, right, from the north, right? Just saying that before Gabriel would like to make a question. Dale,
Ahí va la pregunta. Bueno, nos ha enseñado sobre la pedagogía de la desimaginación y justamente nos ha indicado que el lenguaje de la democracia ha sido saqueado. Considerando lo que sostiene Henry respecto a la importancia de un lenguaje político emancipatorio, ¿cómo podría relacionarse eso con el imperativo democratizador de las políticas de educación sexual integral o los desafíos de género y educación, muy importantes para la radicalización de las actuales democracias y una escuela más justa, especialmente en nuestro país?
Okay, so let me think a little bit. So considers that you have just explained about the importance of an emancipatory political language that could be related to the democratization, right, imperative of comprehensive sexual education policies and gender and education challenges as very important for the radicalization of current democracies and fairer schools, especially in our country. What is the relationship of all this, let's say, political frames into the development of this collective resistance that you mentioned in your speech?
You really can't have resistance unless you understand the forms of domination and all of their variations that work in any society. And it seems to me that one of the things that we've seen in the last 30 years, particularly in the South, is a heightened awareness of the different instances of domination, whether they're sexual, whether they're economic, whether they deal with the environment. And it seems to me as the range of oppressions expand and we become more aware of their interrelationships and their distinctive forms of oppression, we're in a better position to fight them. We're in a better position to make the forces that produce them transparent, whether we're talking about sex education in the schools in ways that offer multiple opportunities for people to recognize that one's sexual identity is not just simply a matter of preference or a joke, but is crucial to one's identity and what it means for different forms of power to suppress that in terms of a certain kind of masculine normativity. So it seems to me that question is crucial because it highlights two things for me. One is, how do we develop new forms of recognition that translate into pedagogical forms of knowledge that young people can understand and teachers can understand? How do we shift their consciousness, right? And expand the possibilities for understanding how domination works. Secondly, what does it mean to recognize that the form of domination that they often face is that they're defined by their deficits? How do you turn their deficits into strengths? I grew up as a working class kid. I was told from day one that I spoke too fast, that you should separate emotion from knowledge. Shouldn't touch people. It's all bullshit, right? I mean, once you learn that those deficits are really your strengths, you learn something fundamental related to Gabriel, who, by the way, actually could be in a movie because he looks just like Che Guevara. He really does.
Really?
Yeah, he does. It's
Okay.
shocking.
My God.
But I mean, it seems to me that how do you deal with the fact that when people are voiceless, they're powerless? And how do we take these forms of domination, translate them into curriculum forms of knowledge, and then practices that allow students to articulate their identities, which are often repressed, in safe spaces that allow them to actually engage in a dialogue and be able to defend their own sense of what it means to be in the world and their relationship to others. Thirdly, what does it mean to make sure that teachers have the power to do that? Because I don't think we can talk about any of this unless we talk about the conditions of labor that allow teachers to have a degree of autonomy. And as long as the state completely controls what we do and tells us to fill out standardized forms and engage in all this bureaucratic madness, that's a form of de-skilling. And it can't be detached from what we teach, how we teach, what our political sensibilities are, and what the purpose of education is.
Okay, all right. I think we have one more question, and that would be like the last question, we promise.
Sure.
Not to abuse from your time and your generosity. Okay, so I think that Norma, or well, I can make it myself. I don't know. Norma, would you like, ¿vos querés hacer la pregunta o? Sí, hace la voz. sorry, sometimes I just switch into Spanish and English at the same time. I am a teacher of English. 80% of my day I am speaking in English, so it's difficult for me as well. So, so that's
Estás
why.
muteada,
Okay.
Norma. Estás
Norma,
muteada.
estás muteada, sí. Okay.
Lo estás haciendo excelente, Eugenia.
Muchas
La
gracias.
verdad que
Gracias.
excelente tu participación, sería muy difícil. Y tiene que ver con la formación docente. Digamos, yo soy ahora de licencia, pero muchos años que trabajo en la formación docente y me parece que es un momento propicio como para dejar alguna idea, algún posicionamiento sobre cómo formar o cuáles serían aquellas pautas que no podemos dejar de pensar en quienes se están formando hoy como profesores de la educación. Me parece importante su ideas y su pensamiento y su mirada para poder formar realmente docentes políticos.
Okay, so Norma highlights the fact that, well, most of us, all of us, right, are teacher educators, right? We all work at the teacher education level. And she states that it is so important to form teachers that are political, let's say, that are committed to the political issue, and that are not, as you mentioned in your question before, right, that do not put a, let's say, a distance between, right, the commitment to the world, the development of critical citizenship, and the importance, right, of reading the word and reading the world in Paulo Freire's words. So what would be a word, an idea, right, or a positioning in your perspective towards initial teacher education institutions, right, considering the profiles of teachers?
I mean, I think there are a couple of things. I mean, I think that, you know, because I myself was educated in the teacher education program. So I'm quite familiar with what Norm is getting at with that question. I mean, you know, there are three things about teacher education that it seems to me are crucial. One is that teachers have to be educated to rethink the mission of education in general. You know, the mission of education is not to create people simply for the workforce. I'm sorry. The purpose of education should be to expand the possibilities and the ideals of a democracy. That suggests that teachers have to take on the role of citizen activists. They can't be simply defined as neutral, objective, removed, that they have a role as public intellectuals, and that role, they should be educated for that role. They have an obligation, to put it differently, for that role. And therefore, we should educate teachers in ways that not only viewed schooling as being crucial to democracy, but also what it means to provide educators with the broad range of knowledge that they'll need to be able to systemically address issues in ways that really matter. Thirdly, I think they have a responsibility to address social problems and to connect their work, whether in the classroom or outside of the classroom, with issues that really matter. And fourthly, they can't do it alone. They have to basically link up the social movements. They have to work together. You can't fight this battle in an isolated way as a teacher. And I think that teacher education programs have to reinforce the sense of solidarity, the need to work together, the need to work with other groups, and not to view schooling and teaching and pedagogy as some kind of isolated method. Teacher education has to get beyond the fetishization of methods. Methods are basically awful, you know? I mean, they don't teach you anything. They're just scripts that ignore context, that often ignore the cultures in which people operate. They ignore questions of class, power, race. They're really a depoliticizing machine. So the real question becomes, how do you prevent teachers from being depoliticized and at the same time give them the power to act as responsible public intellectuals and social agents?
Okay. Thank you very much, Henry, for this fantastic talk and this wonderful exchange, right, with all the topics that I think that would be very beneficial for all the teachers that attend this Congress. I will turn into Spanish just to share these ideas with my colleagues. Solo agradecerle a Henry Giroux por estas palabras tan provocadoras y que nos llevan a la reflexión, y yo creo que van a ser, la verdad que, como se dice en inglés, food for thought, que van a ser un alimento para el pensamiento para todos los profes y las profes que son parte del Congreso de Educación e Inclusión desde el Sur. Compañeros, ¿algo más para decirle antes que culminemos?
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. All right.
Thank you.
Agradecer mucho.
Okay. Gustavo?
No, que es realmente un gusto y un privilegio para nosotros poder tener su palabra en el Congreso. Muchas gracias.
A pleasure and a privilege for us to have you with us in our Congress. So thank you so much, Henry Giroux.
Thank you. Bye-bye.